All right. So I wanted to just talk first of all about the exam coming up, because it's usually, it's this thing that's on everybody's mind, and it's like it's scary, and it looms. And so I was just doing like a little analysis of like the I guess the learning objectives they cover in the exam, and I found that just like four topic areas account for like 73% of the questions. So I was like, well, that'd be good to know for people. Like people want to know that. The biggie is the adjusting entries, which is actually four learning objectives in the textbook. It's 3P1, prepare adjusting entries for deferral of expenses. 3P2, prepare adjusting entries for deferral of revenues. 3P3, prepare adjusting entries for accrued expenses. 3P4, prepare adjusting entries for accrued revenues. Those four sections, so all the adjusting entries account for, what is that, 24 questions, which is like almost half. So if you're not feeling comfortable with adjusting entries, it's going to be a tough exam. Okay. If you're like, I'm so comfortable with adjusting entries, like I do them for fun. I sit around with my friends and I'm like, I think this is a deferred revenue, then like you're going to kill this exam, right? So I'm just saying, I think you'd want to know that like a big chunk of the points are coming on adjusting entries. And then, so that was the first big category, adjusting entries. And then closing entries, right? Being able to close out the temporary accounts, the revenue, expense, and dividend accounts at the end of the period. That was another big one. I think there was like 8 questions on that one topic. That's learning objective 3PE6. And then bank reconciliation, there was like 5 questions on that. And then like 6 questions on internal control procedures. So like, I mean, and then, the others are like you'd think, a couple on like on the ratios from chapter 3, and a couple on the ratios from chapter 6. 1 or 2 on like defining cash and cash equivalents, and then I think a couple on like, if you have an adjusted trial balance, can you create a financial statement from that, right? Which makes sense. Like, and again, like, so in real life, financial accounting really is, looking at these reports and interpreting these reports, and but from financial accounting class, you would think it's creating the reports. And honestly, in real life, I just go like, reports, drop down, income statement, right? And it produces. And so it's more about me being able to talk with because I do a lot of consulting type stuff where I sit with business owners and I say, okay, so here's what your numbers are saying. Let's try to convert this into real world action. What can you do to actually improve your bottom line based on what we're seeing here? So all these things you're learning really are like real accounting stuff. It's just right now, think of this as like when you're in like 4th grade and you were learning your times tables, you're learning like the underlying principles that sort of become really important. So much so that accountants, like my students who have parents that are accountants, would be like, why are they teaching you that? Like, I never do that. And it's like, yeah, but you wouldn't understand what you do if you hadn't learned these basic principles. It's kind of like saying I never use my times tables, and yet we use them all the time, right? Just not as directly. So that was, I don't know, a 3-minute spiel, maybe 4, on the exam. Any questions about that? Like, again, I can't tell you exact questions, but I thought just knowing the general topics and the learning objectives, so that's where you find them in the text, might be helpful. And certainly I could do a review of any of those concepts if you wanted me to. If you're like, yeah, I still don't get adjusting entries or whatever.
I just have a quick question about cash equivalents.
Uh-huh.
So I thought accounts receivable would be a cash equivalent, but not necessarily. It's not, right?
It's not.
Okay,
It is,
not
but
at
not
all.
necessarily. No, it's not. And the reason it's not is because in order for something to be a cash equivalent, and I don't think they state this well in any textbook I've ever seen, not only does it have to be something that's like pretty much immediately redeemable, they say within 90 days, but typically, if you think about in real life, you're thinking stuff you can get at and use. And it has to be redeemable for some like set or known amount. This is why, like, even though I have stocks and I could sell my stocks and get my money within usually 3 days of settlement period, we don't consider it a cash equivalent because it's not a known amount I can get. It's going to depend on the market. And
Okay.
so accounts receivable, you have to collect in order to get it. And we know there's always a certain portion of accounts receivable that's very hard to collect, and a portion that's usually quite easy to. So typically we're talking about actual physical cash accounts like checking accounts, savings accounts, um, certificates of deposit that have a maturity date of 90 days or less. So that's like a bank CD, or like some things like they're called like short-term government paper, which means these little short-term loans you make to the government that are 90 days or less. That's usually what we include in cash and cash equivalents.
Is that a treasury bill?
Yeah, it would be like a really short-term T-bill. That again, these are things that people like park their money into when it's like they want something really safe that can be redeemed in a short period of time. But right now they're not super, just the interest rates stink, right? On anything like short term, or on anything, period. But the people aren't using them a lot. Most people are just putting their money in like a money market account's another one, which is like a high yield savings account, but it's a little more risky because it's not FDIC insured. So that's, I guess, getting beyond the scope of this. Sorry, but yes, these are really short term loans to the government. They'll call it government paper or short-term treasury bills. Did that help, Kendra?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
I was just thinking, usually accounts receivable is like a month or so. So in my mind, it was short-term cash, but that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it would be awesome, if you could always collect all your AR. But
Yeah.
it's actually interesting, like management of accounts receivable is one of the big eights. So one of the top 8 reasons businesses fail in the first 2 years, because they might have really good revenue, but then they can't collect it. And it's no fun. Like, I had a storage business, and that's all about trying to get people to pay, because they put their stuff in there and then they're like, oh, I got my stuff stored, and they stop paying you. And it's just misery. And I make my wife do it because she's way better at it than me. Because I'm calling and I'm like, you have to pay or I'm going to sell your stuff. And then I like don't want to sell their stuff because I'm like and she'll just be like, I know, I'm sorry you're having such a hard time, but so when can we expect that payment? Like, she's so good. She should be a collections person, except that she hates making phone calls. So, trade-offs. All right. Other questions about the exam or the concepts I mentioned in the exam that you might be facing in the exam? You're like, I got this. Easy.
Okay, so I have to think of things like in words, like if that makes sense. Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm thinking about adjusting the right way. When I'm adjusting, and this, I don't even know if this will make sense to people, but when I'm adjusting when I'm increasing, then it's expenses over payables. And when I'm adjusting out, so I'm decreasing, then it's payables over expense. Does that make sense?
No, not to me.
No, okay.
So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying those terms don't, like, adjusting in or adjusting out doesn't.
See, like,
Are you
like
talking
I know
about
what she
are you
said.
talking
She's
about
like,
expense
it's the
adjustments or
debit
revenue
notes on the
adjustments?
top.
yeah.
So you're
Yeah,
thinking of the debit is what she's referring to, because when you expense, you're
Yeah.
going to debit.
Right.
If I'm
Yeah.
increasing my expense, it's expense over payable. And if I'm decreasing to adjust it, it's payable over expense.
So we never credit expenses except for when we do closing entries. So
I saw my husband's P&L and they do have a negative expense. I've never seen that
do
before
you
in
know
my
what a
life.
negative expense is called? A revenue.
A revenue.
It is. They do. They count it as revenue on the P&L, but they transfer. They have like a rebuild shop or whatever,
Mhm.
and they transfer the asset out to another branch, and so they
Yeah.
get revenue and they spend. It goes to the expense on their account, on the other one account.
But probably we don't want to get into that at this level of a course.
Okay.
So just for our purposes, the only time we credit an expense is if A, we're closing it,
Mhm.
we're going to credit it, so we take the balance down to 0,
Right.
or B, if we're correcting an error. If we're saying, oh, I actually made that expense on accident, I need to credit it to get rid of some expense.
Okay.
And so yeah, are there things, there are things where you're like, is that really a revenue, or is that more like a negative expense? Sometimes we do like offset expenses using certain things, but I think it would just be confusing at this stage of the game to think in those terms. So with adjusting entries, there's always an expense
Uh-huh.
or a revenue. And when we do an expense and adjusting entry, it's always going to be debited. And when we
Okay.
do a revenue, it's always going to be credited. And so when we have these deferred expenses, right? This is like
Mhm.
when I'm going to have an expense in the future. What I'm doing is I'm recognizing right now, when I first make the transaction, I'm gaining an asset. So like I'm buying supplies. And rather than just writing those as an expense when I buy them, I keep them as an asset, supplies, and defer the expense till I've actually used them. And then in the future, I'll debit supplies expense and credit the supply. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that sorry, I'm like, that helped. Okay. So I think I'm thinking about it right. I'm just
Using different
Sure.
terms than I would, which is totally
just how I have to think
fine.
about it.
Totally fine as long
I'll
as it's
never
working
be
for you, right?
okay.
So no,
Okay, so okay, that helps. Now I'll
yeah,
think about it the
I
right
feel like
way.
the whole like accrual accounting is one of those things that's like it would be way easier to do cash-based accounting, but ultimately it wouldn't be, because we'd be doing weird stuff like expensing an entire building in a single month and not recognizing the building itself lasts for 360 months. And so while it does seem like it's easier, ultimately it gives us a much more accurate understanding of our financial situation, which is
And
why
it's
we do
better
it.
for taxes, yeah.
Yeah, I
Also,
mean, well, I don't
gives you more
know.
write-off, right?
Well, it's not more. It just spreads the write-off out over a longer period.
Ah, okay.
But like if I made $1 million this year and I bought a building for $900,000 and took it all as an expense, I would still get to write all that off, right? It would make my net income only 100,000, but it wouldn't really be accurate because I'm deriving financial benefit from that building for the next 25 years or whatever it is. And so the expense should be spread out across that. Yeah.
Also, Aaron, with the entries, what I've found that's really like a help to me is to like focus on one entry. So like if it's like a deal that involves cash or whatever, and
Mhm.
you already know that cash is either increasing or decreasing, then it's really easy to figure out the other one. As long
Oh,
as you know which
okay.
account it is. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah.
So pay attention to the cash.
Well, be careful. Adjusting entries don't ever involve cash,
That
ever.
Oh
helps.
yeah, not adjusting, but just entries in general, or like, maybe not cash, but like one account. Like,
Right.
oh, I
Okay.
already know this is expense account is going to be increased, so then your other account would be the
Thank you.
opposite.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
That helps.
Like always recognize that it has to balance, right? Your debits have to equal your credits. And so if you know one of them for sure, like I know assets increase with the debit and I have an asset increasing here, then you know the other thing is going to be a credit. And like I'm still amazed by the number of students who are totally getting it when you talk about it, but then they get in an exam scenario when they're getting nervous about it or whatever, and their debits won't equal their credits. And it's not because they're dumb. It's not because they don't know it. It's because it's like that part of their brain freezes in that moment. And then later they're like, oh, what the heck? How did I do that? So, slowing it down and being like, I always have a debit and a credit and they always balance. And because usually at least one of them. You like know, okay, this one I know it's a debit. And then the other one is that what you're saying, Daphne? That helps. I still do that, just so you know.
Yeah. And then also like on bank balance stuff, whenever
Mhm.
you're doing the like
Reconciliation.
side by side reconciliation, if you subtract or find the difference between the two balances if you've gotten to the end and you're like, oh, they aren't balancing, I don't know why, just subtract, get the difference. And then you can usually like look back at your information and go, oh, that's the transaction I'm missing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
interesting. That's good. I teach in a QuickBooks class. And so constantly when people submit their thing, I'm looking at their trial balance and I can see how it's different from the trial balance that I have worked out. And then usually what I do is just find the difference, right? And then I can pinpoint pretty quick which transactions they're missing or whatever. So that's good advice too.
Thank you. You're saving my exam. Because I do a little bit of panic in the exams.
It's scary, like, I don't know why, I don't think scary is the right word, but like, it's easy to just be like, to feel like it's different than doing homework or something. And it is because you don't get to check, but
Is this one going to be multiple choice like
Yeah.
the last one?
Yep.
Awesome.
all right. So that's the exam. One person emailed me and said, I can't be here tonight, but would you be willing to like go over a certain problem? And I was like, for sure. But I'd like to make sure that, those of you who are here, that we would do your stuff first. And then if you had to leave, I can still work out their problem on the recording, you know what I mean, and post it. So anybody have any problems or questions, like specific things they wanted to look at or talk about in the material for the last week? You guys are just all smart. It's all smart kids that sign in here. You're like, are you the kids that sit in the front of the class when you go to like a in-person class? I saw some yeses and some nos. I try to sit in the middle, but that's after years of being a teacher, because as a teacher, you're always like, oh, the back row kids, those guys. And then you're like, oh, the front row kids, those guys. The front row kids, they're like Hermione, right? Like, oh, professor. Nah.
I have ADD. So if I don't sit in the front, I get like ultra distracted.
Helps you stay focused, huh?
Yeah.
So let me look at what the person who emailed me asked about. It was, sorry. I love that we live in an era where you have like 5 different email accounts on your phone and you have to like judge between all of them. Let's see. Question 9 from last week's quiz. So quiz. Okay, my pen's not writing, so that's not awesome. So let me take a look at last week's quiz. And maybe there'll be something valuable in there for the whole group. The last week's quiz would be, I'm assuming they mean the chapter 6 quiz. And then number 9, oh, there's only 6 questions on last week's quiz. That's an issue for me here. And they said number 9 on last week's quiz. Over question 9 from last week's quiz.
Brother Fox, the quiz
Yeah.
for only has 6 questions, so maybe we're looking at this
Chapter
week's.
3.
Oh no.
Because that's chapter 6, which is, I guess that's this week's quiz. I was just thinking the last quiz.
It's chapter 3.
Maybe they mean chapter 3 quiz. I'll do my best. This one's for you, Anne. If it's the wrong one, you can berate me or whatever makes you happy. All right. I'm not afraid to be berated. I got 8 kids, so I raised a bunch of teenagers. I've been berated before. Let's see. Let me share my screen. You know why? Because sharing is caring. Let's see. All right. So we have an adjusted trial balance. Well, good, because I just told you what, there's 3 or 4 questions about this idea. So it says, use the table of adjusted trial balance accounts for Start Company to prepare the income statement, statement of retained earnings, and the balance sheet. So here we have, so here's our adjusted trial balance for the Start Company. I've heard they make some pretty cool military tech. And so the first thing you're going to prep is the income statement, right? Which is just a summary of our revenues and expenses. And what's nice about trial balances is they're put in order. And so we have all the balance sheet accounts down through common stock and retained earnings. Then we have the dividends, which get used for the statement of retained earnings or the statement of owner's equity, depending on which one you're preparing. And then the income statement, which is the revenues and expenses. So really, it's just all of this stuff right here is going to be exactly what goes into my income statement. So I have revenues, service revenues, 20,000. All my expenses, there they all are right there. Put right there. Add those up to get total expenses. Revenue minus total expenses is net income. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And I think she was asking specifically about the balance sheet. And I have a guess as to what was tripping her up. But so the statement of retained earnings is always just your retained earnings at the beginning of the period, plus your net income, minus your dividends, gives you your retained earnings at the end of the period. So again, to find our retained earnings at the beginning of the period, we come up here and look at the trial balance. So we have 14,800. Add the net income that we just calculated on the income statement. That gives us a subtotal. Subtract the dividends, which we'll find again up here on the adjusted trial balance. And then that will give us the retained earnings at the end of the period. That's pretty easy. I don't know if easy is the right word, but straightforward. And then the balance sheet is all of these accounts. So there's our assets, and then our liabilities. Whoops, another one. And then our common stock and our retained earnings. So again, those transfer down pretty directly. Our assets, cash, accounts receivable, supplies, prepaid insurance, buildings, and then so we have all those assets, and then the buildings less their accumulated depreciation will give us the total for buildings. That'll be our total assets. Our liabilities, again, those just come straight down. Accounts payable, interest payable, wages earned, and notes payable. That gives us total liabilities. Common stock's going to come straight off of the adjusted trial balance. But what gets people is the retained earnings, because they'll look up here and they'll take this retained earnings that's on the trial balance, and they'll put it here, and then they'll be like, it doesn't balance, right? And it's because this is the retained earnings at the beginning of the year, and we're looking for the retained earnings at December 31st, at the end of the year. So this is the retained earnings that we calculated in our statement of retained earnings, our end of year retained earnings. Take it there, total it up, it all balances, and we find joy. When they balance, there's always this little moment, like this little like the world is at peace. At least for me. Maybe not everybody feels that way, but I honestly think we're tapping into the eternal when things balance out, because the universe is a place of order, and when we make something orderly, we get this little momentary feeling of like satisfaction, and then your 3-year-old grandkid tears it up again. So that's cool. But for the moment. All right, so that was for Anne. I hope that was helpful to her. It was actually not a bad review in the sense that there's, like I said, 3 or 4 questions on the exam that cover this very thing: take an adjusted trial balance and make financial statements. So hopefully that was useful. Any other concepts or other things? Also, we don't have to stay for a full hour. If we're all like, we're good, I could use this time to work on my homework, I'm also okay with that.
So on that balance sheet you were just looking at, the only reason that buildings and depreciation of buildings is in the left column is because they're doing a subtraction.
Yeah, so they're showing us that they're gonna show us the cost less the accumulated depreciation equals what we call the book value of the building.
And that's the only reason it's
it's not a debit and a credit. That confuses people too sometimes, because they're like, these aren't debits and credits. This is just like a subtotal, and then this is giving us the total.
And then equity's just down there on the other side.
Yeah, and why they did that way, I don't know.
Okay, well, if you don't know, then I won't worry.
No, I mean, the thing is like, if you go look at balance sheets, you will see some that will even lump, like they'll just have a line item for buildings and another for accumulated depreciation, and they'll be in the same line, and then they'll just total that whole thing up. Others will do it this way, so you have like a subtotal that's in the same column as all your other totals. I guess they did it this way so that we could add up our equities and then put the total here, but we added up all our liabilities. So why they did it this way, I don't know. These are the types of things where I want to drive out to California and find someone at McGraw-Hill and rough them up, but I'm not a violent person, so I don't do that. I just I don't know. I think violent thoughts, and so unfortunately, that's still not great. All right. If you've
Looking at
if you've
last
beaten up
week's
a software engineer in your heart, it's the same as if you've. I think I could take that out of the Sermon on the Mount. All right, Daphne, sorry.
No worries. Looking at last week's, I'm wondering if Anne was talking about the quiz access number 9, because
No,
that one was beast.
okay, she said the quiz and even asked, "Are you
Oh,
allowed to
did
do
she?
quizzes?" And she said it was on the balance sheet. But we could
Okay.
we could totally look at that one, but I don't know if it's kind of past its prime unless it would help somebody for the exam. What was beast about it?
Oh,
It was just big. There was like a lot to it. I know it took me just little stuff I would forget to move over and stuff like that, but I don't usually go all through all 3 of my checks, but it took me
Right.
all 3 checks to get that one.
So it was easy to make errors on because there was so
Mm-hmm.
many little things to worry about. Oh yeah.
So the exam is just on the stuff we've just learned the last couple weeks and not going back very far.
Correct.
Like
It
our
is
first exam.
it is just chapters. Let me see if I can find it here.
Speaking of that concept, is like the final going to be for like the whole semester, or like for
Unfortunately, yes, the final
it's cumulative.
is cumulative. I know it's a dirty trick. So I believe that this exam just covers chapters 3 and 6.
Oh, nice.
Let me double check that though, so I'm not lying to you. Because people get mad when you lie to them. I don't know. I mean, let's see. Like, why are you mad at me? It was an accidental lie.
So I don't know how to say this the right way, but I'm hoping. So on that quiz access number 9, since it's a multiple choice, we can expect to not see that question. It was so long. Oh,
You will not see that question. In other
oh,
words,
thank you.
you will not see something presented in that way, right? Because
Okay, that's fine.
because it's all going to be questions like, an adjusting entry that increases revenue and decreases liability is known as a
Awesome.
deferred revenue or whatever. Like it's going to be stuff like that, or ones where it has you work it out, but then gives you 4 choices for the number, right? So in format, it will not be really any different than the first exam, but in content, of course, it's going to be covering
Okay.
these 2 chapters, 3 and 6.
That helps because that one scared me.
You don't have
If it was
to.
like 6 of those, I'm like, oh, we get 5 hours and 46 minutes. I could be in real trouble.
All right. Other questions, comments, rants? Ranting doesn't really help, but sometimes it feels cathartic. And like I said, oh yeah, and sorry I'm wearing a t-shirt. Don't judge me. Okay, I went walking between my regular classes and this one. So at least you don't have to smell my walking smell because technology. So that's a plus. Like we can meet across long distances and it renders BO pretty much irrelevant. All right. So you're welcome. Thank you, Zoom.
Middle schoolers need that more.
Oh yeah, no. My daughter works in a kindergarten and
Sir.
she's like, they had a kid, they still have accidents sometimes, but they're old enough to get embarrassed, so they don't want to tell you. So you got to like walk up and down the aisles with the sniff checker going until you're like, oh, it's you. Hey, how about we take you to the nurse's office? I'm not sick, I know, but we're gonna visit the nurse anyway. Like that. She's like, we don't get paid enough for this. She's like, why do college professors make more than kindergarten teachers? You don't have to deal with any of this. I'm like, I don't know, man. Go back and get your PhD, kid. All right. Well, thanks for, I mean, I appreciate these meetings just because I feel like it's sometimes hard to put a human face with online classes, and so getting to meet a few of you is always a wonderful thing for me, and I hope it's valuable. And because I could like put out video, it's still not the same as meeting. So if you have other questions come up, don't be afraid to email me. And I try. It's hard, but we try to set up individual meetings, but we're all busy too. So finding times often that match two people's schedule is challenging. But I will try if there's something you really need to look at or go over. All right, are we good for the night? All right, well, thanks for taking the time to be here, and hopefully I can get back to our regular schedule last Thursday thing. I say that, but there'll be some other thing come up someday. All right, have a great night. Anybody, Aaron already robbed us of our chance to say a prayer, so now we have to let someone else. That's a joke. She volunteered graciously to say the prayer for us. Any other prayer sayers for us? I know Daphne said it before. I don't know if Kendra said a prayer for us before.
I'll say it.
All right,
Do you
that'd be
want to stop recording or are you good?
yeah, because it weirds me out. Is that weird that it weirds me out?
Yeah, it kind of weirds me out a little too.